Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 24 for History 101. And we were talking about the National Bank building up to the election of 1832. So, once again, if you want to look in the back of your book on page A21, we can see the candidates who are running for the presidency in 1832. And obviously, one of them is Andrew Jackson, running for re-election. Now, you'll notice that his main competition and major vote getter will be former Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams and the great compromiser himself from Kentucky, Henry Clay, will run as the National Republican candidate. Now, you'll also notice there's another National Republican candidate running by the name of John Floyd. John Floyd is from the state of South Carolina, and he's basically running because South Carolina is still very angry about the nullification crisis. So in reality, I don't know if he's a National Republican. Maybe you might term him as I'm John Floyd, and we hate Andrew Jackson in South Carolina Party. He's going to win 11 Electoral College votes, as you can see. That's how many South Carolina's worth. He wins South Carolina. Now, there's another person there who will get, 33,000 votes, 7 Electoral College votes. That's William Wirt. And he's from a flash-in-the-pan party that will only appear in one election. And if you look in your book, that's the AntiMasonic Party. Now, the reason why we're talking about them is they're going to start a tradition that will last forever in American political parties. But let me tell you about what they are all about, this Anti-Masonic Party. They're very suspicious of the men's group known as the Masons, which still exists today. Masons in many big cities are very elite people, and back in this day and age, the Masons are a group that some people believe in a conspiracy theory that they secretly run the United States. If you've seen the film, I think the name is National Treasure. It's all about this conspiracy theory. But back in the day, here's what the Anti-Masonic Party believed. They pointed out the fact that up to that point in history, every single president had been a Mason. And they argued that the Masons secretly run the United States, and they get together and make the policy decisions and pick who's going to be president, and that there's even a secret Masonic room in the White House where all these decisions are made. Now, it's a conspiracy theory, but it sounds good at the time. There might be people who still believe it. I don't know. But, so their argument is the selection of presidential candidates needs to be out in the open, not made in some secret room or behind closed doors in Congress or wherever it's made. So the Anti-Masonic Party will be the very first political party to hold a national nominating convention where anti-Masonic people from all across the country will gather, and they're going to nominate openly William Wirt to be their candidate. Now, in every election after that, the major political parties in America all hold national nominating conventions. As you may know, we've got a couple scheduled for this summer. Already they're being delayed, and they may have to be virtual because of COVID-19. But regardless, they'll still have a virtual nominating convention where, in all likelihood, obviously, Donald Trump will be renominated by the Republicans, and it looks like Joe Biden will be nominated by the Democrats. So, William Wirt will be this minor third-party candidate, but starts this tradition. And you'll notice that William Wirt gets 7 electoral college votes. Guess which state William Wirt wins? He wins the state of Vermont. Vermont always loves a good conspiracy theory, and they were dominated by the Anti-Masonic Party in that particular election. So remember, Andrew Jackson's out on the campaign trail, campaigning that a vote for him is a vote against the bank because he has vetoed the rechartering of it in his hatred for the bank that I explained to you earlier. In reality, as I mentioned before, your average American could care less about that bank. It's Jackson that hates it. Jackson will win very handily, as you can see, and win re-election. And when that occurs, Jackson announces, the people have spoken. I'm going to get rid of the national bank, even though it has 4 years left on its charter. So Andrew Jackson will then proceed to dismantle the bank by withdrawing all federal funds from the national bank. And what he does with those funds creates another controversy, known as the pet bank scandal. He will deposit that federal money that he took out of the national bank and deposit it in state banks. Back in this day and age, each state had its own bank still. But he'll only deposit money into state banks in states that voted for him. If you voted against him, like Vermont or South Carolina, you didn't get a cent deposited in your banks. That's why this is known as the pet bank scandal. Just more controversy surrounding the highly controversial Andrew Jackson. So, where we want to go next is something we skipped over. We're going to talk about Indian removal. Now, this is covered in your book. Let me find the page here. Land in the 5 Civilized Tribes says on page 256. But we have a map that we want to take a look at that it might have been in the previous chapter. No, it's not. The map that we want to look at to understand this is on page 265. But let me tell you the story behind all of this. Obviously, most of you probably studied the most famous event that is related to Indian removal, the Trail of Tears that the Cherokee go through in high school. You probably studied it. And there's that famous painting of the Trail of Tears on the facing page 264. We'll get to that momentarily. But first we need to know the background information on why Andrew Jackson was so hell-bent on removing the Indians, especially a group we talked about at the very beginning of class, and I told you we'd get back to, the 5 civilized tribes from their homelands out to an area in the West, which will become known as the Indian Territory that you can see on this map. But first, the background information. If you take a look at this map closely, you can see where the Cherokee are in northern Georgia, into parts of Tennessee and North Carolina. You can see where Creek land is in Georgia and Alabama. Then also look at the Chickasaw and the Choctaw Indians. Their tribal land controls nearly half of the state of Mississippi. Now, you can also see the other of the 5 civilized tribes control central Florida, the Seminoles, who we've talked about from time to time, the abolitionist Indians. So, there's a lot of pressure being placed on the Jackson administration, especially by the state of Georgia, to remove specifically the 5 civilized tribes, and in the case of Georgia, the Cherokee. Georgia starts this by passing a Georgia state law removing the Cherokee Indians from the state of Georgia, saying, you all got to get up and leave. We don't want you here anymore. The Cherokee, which are a highly advanced Indian tribe, we talked about them, the reason why they call these the 5 civilized tribes. Cherokee were the first to develop a written language, an alphabet. They had a constitution modeled after the U.S. Constitution. They printed bilingual newspapers. They were advanced farmers who exported crops out of their lands. Unfortunately, they held slaves. They looked and acted like their white, quote-unquote, civilized neighbors. That's why these tribes are called the 5 civilized tribes. Now, Georgia passes this law. Attorneys representing the Cherokee Nation take it all the way to the Supreme Court. And ultimately, in a series of decisions, the Supreme Court rules that the Georgia state law is unconstitutional, that due to past practice, the only one who can enter into agreements with the Native American tribes is the federal government. Because from the Washington administration forward, the federal government has been signing treaties with Indian nations. And the court says the states don't have that power. So, Andrew Jackson in 1832 traveled around the South in his campaign. Remember, he's not very popular in the South because of nullification, promising Southern states, reelect me, and I'll get those Indians removed. I'll get a federal law passed. If that's what it takes, that's what it's going to take. So, elect me, I'll remove them. So, Southern states supported this. Jackson's reelected, so he's going to fulfill his campaign promise to the Southern states. And he gets the Indian Removal Act passed through Congress and implemented after he's reelected. It's passed before, but now he's going to implement it due to his campaign promises. Now, the Indian Removal Act, contrary to popular belief, does not simply remove the 5 civilized tribes from their land. It removes more than 90 tribes east of the Mississippi to a territory that Jackson sets up known as the Indian Territory. And you can see many of these Indian tribes that end up there. Any tribe that had not entered into a treaty agreement and created what amounted to a reservation was removed from their lands to this Indian Territory, and they all had to move, including some Indians from New York State that hadn't had treaty arrangements. The Mohawk Indians had treaties with the government, so they weren't removed. So, Andrew Jackson argues that this removal is needed, not because of the reason he told the southern states, that it was there to preserve Native American culture. He argued that Native culture was being distorted by their white neighbors, so they needed all to be moved to the middle of nowhere so they could preserve their cultural traditions. Now, if you believe that, I've got some land down in a swamp I can sell you. It's all nonsense. So, the main group, now remember there's 90 tribes, and you can see many of them shown to you on this map, including the Seneca Indians from the state of New York, are removed to the Indian Territory, which most of it later on will become the state of Oklahoma. Now, the one that gets the most publicity is the Cherokee, because they're the ones who fought Georgia's removal in the Supreme Court, and they won, and they thought they had won for good, but then Jackson is going to remove them anyway, even though it appears that if this was challenged to the court would side with the Native people. They never got the chance. Jackson will enter into negotiations with the Cherokee and work out a deal with them where they'll be paid for their land. But out of that payment for their land, they also have to pay for their removal to Oklahoma. And you can see how far that is they have to travel in all these tribes. And we'll talk about the Seminoles in a second. Cherokee get the most publicity. Their removal was horrible, but a lot of these other removals were pretty bad also. But what happens to the Cherokee, and you can see by this famous painting, they're a highly advanced civilization, and they have to pack up everything they own into covered wagons that they buy with government money and literally move via wagon, and some people walking, as you can see. You can see some poor women there holding the hands of their children and a pack dog. You know, there's another woman in the middle there with her child and a baby on her back. Her child's carrying a puppy, and there's her dog. Some people literally have to walk from northern Georgia all the way to Oklahoma. Now, supposedly, this is going to be a smooth transition. There's delay after delay, and they end up doing it in the winter, which is the first big mistake, because you can see how bundled up these people are. It's very cold on this journey. Then, according to the government, who has made all the arrangements for them using money that they supposedly was Cherokee money, but the government's spending it on their behalf. First, they buy them these wagons. They've made arrangements for drinking water and food to be at designated spots along the Cherokee Trail, as it's known, which becomes known as the Trail of Tears. And also, they make arrangements for ferry boats to meet these people at major rivers to be able to cross the rivers. Because remember, back in this day and age, there aren't a series of bridges crossing all rivers. There aren't roads for cars to drive on. Now, unfortunately, the contractors who get these contracts to deliver food and water are unscrupulous. They'll deliver them rancid meat, which makes these people end up starving to death on this trek. And the drinking water in some cases is undrinkable. It's just a nightmare. The ferry boats that are supposed to safely get these people across the rivers involved are too small. Many of them capsize, and people drown to death in cold, freezing water. This whole adventure is a nightmare. Now, all told, and the reason why it's known as the Trail of Tears, excuse me, I was looking at some of my notes there. Typically, I'd be at a podium. There's a grand total of 18,000 Cherokee at the time. Most of those are removed in this process. Some of them escape into the mountains of North Carolina. That's why there's still a Cherokee settlement there today. But out of this number that's removed, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 18,000, over 4,500 of them die on the way there because they starve to death, don't have enough drinking water, some cases freeze to death, die in capsized ferries. None of this should have taken place because the government was supposed to provide them with safe passage there in an agreement they made to buy the Cherokee land. That's why this horrible event is known as the Trail of Tears. Now, other removals like the Choctaw is not much better. with the Seminoles resist this militarily. And they'll fight a war in the state of Florida known as the Second Seminole Wars. Jackson will have to respond with the United States military. And for a while, it's all the military can do. Just fight to a draw. And in some cases, the Seminoles get the upper hand. Finally, after more reinforcements are sent to Central Florida, the United States military defeats the Seminole Indians in the Second Seminole Wars. Then you'll notice that their passage to Oklahoma is by water. They're going to put them on prison boats, the Seminole tribe, because they're after a war, and ship them via the Mississippi and other rivers to Oklahoma, because they know there's no way they're going to march there. The minute they got out of sight of any American officials, they'd hightail it somewhere else. So they're taken there by prison boat. That's not much better. At least they didn't die in these prison boats, but that's the state of circumstances here. Now, this obviously is a horrible black mark on the Jackson administration. And a lot of historians had interpreted that Jackson did this to Native people because he was a racist and he hated Native Americans. And they, had this theory because Andrew Jackson did indeed, in the War of 1812, fight against some of the 5 civilized tribes who had allied themselves with the British during the War of 1812 and the Pan-Indian movement in Tecumseh. So the line of logic was, he was wounded in one of these battles. He had this hatred for Native American people because of it. And we all know what happens if Andrew Jackson holds a grudge. Just look at the National Bank, look at his cabinet, look at John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay. You don't want to make him mad. Now, later on in the late 1980s, a famous historian from the University of Chicago, Robert Remini, will write what's considered the definitive history of Andrew Jackson. He'll write a 5-volume set on Andrew Jackson. And in his intensive research that he undertakes, he's going to uncover some information that no one knew before. Andrew Jackson, when he lived in the state of Tennessee, one morning, his wife woke up to the sound of a crying baby. She went to the front door, and almost in the storybook tale that you've all heard of before, here's a baby in a basket that somebody had abandoned on the front porch of their plantation house, obviously hoping the family took that child in. Well, Andrew Jackson's wife did. She immediately fell in love with this little boy, and the Jacksons adopted him. As they later discovered, this young boy was a Native American. And they knew that when they adopted him, but they adopted him anyway. Now, Remini argues that this firmly makes the theory that Jackson was a racist null and void. Because who in the world would adopt a child that was from a race you detested if you were a racist? To put it in common terms, it'd be like a Ku Klux Klan member adopting a black boy. You think that's going to happen? I don't. So, here's what Remini argues, and I would agree with him. Andrew Jackson was not a racist. Andrew Jackson was a politician. Andrew Jackson was a ruthless politician and would do anything to be reelected. That included making promises to southern states, reelect me, I'll remove the Indians. He did it for political reasons, not out of racial hatred. The guy was a cutthroat politician, that's true. Racist against Indian people? I don't think so. So, that's Indian removal, as horrible as it is. And that's where I'm going to call it quits today. Next time I speak to you in a day or so, I got to go grade more of those quizzes. By the way, I am working on your quizzes. In fact, I'm going to have your class finished first, so I'll be sending out the results before I even get to my 2 History 102 classes. Plus, I have a stack of state and local government papers. You don't want to hear my woes, but I got way too much to grade. So please be patient. It's going to take me a while to get through this stuff, but your class will be first. Don't tell the History 102 classes that, even though Heather knows. So, that's an inside joke between Heather Curry and myself. So, be safe. In a couple days, I'll lecture again. I'm losing my voice because this is the 5th lecture I've recorded today between your class and History 102. Stay home, and we're going to get through this thing. Things are improving in Clinton County, but we got to keep it that way. So all of you take care. I hope you're all healthy, and I'll see you soon. Bye now.